In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, few truths stand as absolute. The Orks, those green-skinned fungi warriors who spread across the galaxy like a biological plague, are known throughout the Imperium and beyond for their absolute fearlessness. They charge into battle against titans that tower over them like walking cathedrals. They laugh as they face down the living nightmares spawned from the warp itself. They consider a quick death to be boring and a slow, brutal fight to be the highest form of entertainment the universe can offer. These are creatures who view pain as an inconvenience rather than a deterrent, who see their own deaths as nothing more than the end of a good scrap, and who would happily charge into the maw of a tyrannid bio-titan if it meant getting in one more good hit before the end. And yet, there exists a singular exception to this rule of boundless orcish courage, a specific type of enemy that even the most battle-crazed orc warboss will avoid if given the choice. A machine of war so wrong, so fundamentally antithetical to the orcish understanding of proper combat, that it triggers something deep in their psychic gestalt consciousness. An instinct that whispers to them in ways their simple, violence-obsessed minds can barely comprehend. That enemy is the possessed Dreadnought, specifically those chaos war machines that have been corrupted by demonic entities and transformed into something that exists between the material and immaterial realms. To understand why this particular exception exists, we must journey deep into the nature of what makes orcs tick, what makes chaos corruption so uniquely terrible, and how the intersection of these two fundamental forces of the Warhammer 40,000 universe creates a situation so paradoxical that even the orcs, in all their simplicity, instinctively recognize it as wrong. This is not fear as humans understand it. This is something far more primal, something wired into the very psychic fabric that binds all orcs together across the stars. This is the story of why the most fearless warriors in the galaxy will, when faced with the twisted amalgamation of man, machine, and demon that is a possessed dreadnought, choose to find, literally, any other fight. The phenomenon is well documented throughout Imperial records, though often dismissed or misunderstood by those who have never witnessed the peculiarity firsthand. Commissars who have fought alongside Space Marines against Orc incursions have noted the strange behavior. Tech priests who have analyzed battlefield patterns have observed the statistical anomaly. Even Chaos warlords have recognized this unique weakness in their green-skinned foes, though few have been able to exploit it effectively. The question that has puzzled strategic analysts, xenobiologists, and battlefield commanders for millennia remains the same. Why would creatures who charge laughing into Lascanon fire suddenly develop a sense of self-preservation when faced with a possessed dreadnought? The answer lies not in fear, but in the fundamental incompatibility between the psychic field that all orcs generate and the warp-touched nature of demonically possessed war machines. It is a collision of two forces that were never meant to interact, a meeting of energies that creates a repulsion so fundamental that even the orcs' limited capacity for strategic thinking is overridden by pure instinct. To truly understand this phenomenon, we must first understand the orcs themselves, then examine the nature of chaos corruption, and finally explore how these two aspects of the 40k universe interact in ways that even the Adeptus Mechanicus struggles to fully comprehend. The Orc Psyche, Violence as Religion. To grasp why orcs react the way they do to possessed dreadnoughts, we must first understand what orcs are and how their minds work. These creatures are not simply barbaric humanoids with green skin and a penchant for violence. They are a biological weapon system created over 60 million years ago by the ancient species known as the Old Ones, engineered specifically to fight in the war in heaven against the Necrons and their Citan masters. The modern orcs are a degraded version of what were once called the Krork, towering warriors that combined biological resilience with sophisticated technology and tactical acumen that would put most modern armies to shame. But even in their degraded state, orcs retain the fundamental characteristics that made them such effective weapons. Their biology is a fusion of animal and fungal properties, making them incredibly resilient and allowing them to reproduce through spores rather than conventional breeding. More importantly, they possess a collective psychic field known as the WAG, a gestalt consciousness that grows stronger as more orcs gather together. This field is not conscious thought in the way humans understand it, but rather a kind of psychic background noise that permeates orc society and affects everything from their technology to their social hierarchy. The WAG field serves multiple purposes in orc culture and biology. Most obviously, it allows orcs to instinctively recognize which among them is the biggest and strongest, establishing hierarchy without the need for constant challenges. When an orc sees another orc who is larger and more imposing, the WAG field essentially tells them that this orc is in charge, creating a natural chain of command based purely on physical dominance. This is why orc society is organized around the simple principle that might makes right. The biggest orc becomes the war boss, not because of any political maneuvering or strategic brilliance, but because every other orc in the vicinity psychically recognizes his superiority. But the WAG field does far more than establish social order. It fundamentally affects how orc technology functions in ways that confound Imperial scientists and Adeptus, Mechanicus tech priests who try to understand it. Orc weapons are cobbled together from scrap metal, held together with what appears to be little more than faith and excessive amounts of rivets. By all reasonable laws of physics and engineering, these contraptions should not work. A gun made from a metal tube, some springs, and a handful of bullets should not be able to fire with the accuracy and power of a properly manufactured weapon. A vehicle constructed from random pieces of scrap welded together should not be able to move, let alone travel at high speeds, while maintaining any kind of structural integrity. And yet they do work, at least when wielded by orcs. Human soldiers who try to use captured orc weapons often find them malfunctioning or refusing to fire entirely. Vehicles that functioned perfectly well when driven by orcs suddenly break down when Imperial forces try to pilot them. The reason for this apparent impossibility lies in the WAG field itself. The collective belief of the orcs that their technology works actually makes it work through a kind of unconscious psychic manipulation of reality. This is not magic in the traditional sense, and it is not conscious thought. It is simply that when enough orcs believe something strongly enough, their collective psychic field makes it true. This phenomenon extends to other aspects of orc culture as well. Orcs universally believe that vehicles painted red go faster, and so vehicles painted red actually do go faster when driven by orcs. They believe that yellow paint makes explosions bigger, and so their yellow-painted bombs genuinely create larger detonations. They believe that purple is the sneakiest color, making it essentially camouflage, and so orcs wearing purple genuinely become harder to detect. None of this makes any rational sense, but in the presence of the WAG field, rational sense becomes secondary to collective belief. Understanding this collective psychic phenomenon is crucial to understanding why orcs react the way they do to possessed dreadnoughts. The WAG field is not just a tool or a weapon. It is the foundation of orc existence, the invisible force that binds their entire species together across the galaxy. Every orc, from the smallest grot to the mightiest war boss, exists within this field and is shaped by it. Their thoughts, such as they are influenced by it. Their instincts are guided by it. And when something fundamentally disrupts or conflicts with this field, even the most battle-crazed orc notices on an instinctive level that something is profoundly wrong. The orc relationship with combat itself is equally important to understanding their psychology. For humans, war is a means to an end. For orcs, war is the end itself. They do not fight to acquire territory, though they will seize worlds readily enough. They do not fight for resources, though they certainly make use of what they capture. They do not even fight for glory or honor in the way that humans understand those concepts. Orks fight because fighting is what orks do. It is their natural state of being, as fundamental to their existence as breathing is to humans. The concept of peace, of a time without conflict, is utterly alien and even disturbing to the orc mind. This is why orcs will fight literally anyone about literally anything. They will fight enemies of the Imperium with gleeful enthusiasm. They will fight the Imperium itself with equal joy. They will fight Tyranids, Necrons, Tau, Eldar, Dark Eldar, and every other xeno-species in the galaxy. And when there are no external enemies available, they will fight each other with the same fervor they bring to any other battle. Orc tribes wage constant wars against one another, with smaller conflicts erupting over matters as trivial as who gets the best scrap pile or whose paint job is the flashiest. The famous wags that periodically sweep across Imperial space are really just occasions when the orcs temporarily stop fighting each other long enough to go fight someone else. It is worth noting that this love of combat does not translate to mindless suicidal charges, despite what Imperial propaganda might suggest. Orcs are not stupid, though they are certainly simple by human standards. They understand tactics, at least in a crude way. They know when to advance and when to pull back to regroup. They recognize when an enemy is too strong to defeat head-on and will attempt different strategies, even if those strategies usually boil down to variations of hitting things harder or hitting them with more orcs. An orc who retreats from a losing battle does not see this as cowardice or defeat. In their worldview, they are simply going to get more orcs and come back for another go at it. The concept of permanent defeat does not really register in the orc mind. There are only fights you are currently winning, and fights where you need to get more boys before trying again. This psychological framework explains why orcs do not experience fear in the way other species do. Fear, in biological terms, is an evolutionary response designed to keep organisms alive by making them avoid dangerous situations. But orcs were engineered by the old ones to be warriors, and fear would only interfere with that function. They feel pain, certainly, though they seem to enjoy it in a perverse way. They can recognize danger and respond to it tactically, but they do not feel the visceral, paralyzing terror that makes other species flee from overwhelming odds. An orc facing a titan does not think about how outmatched he is or how likely he is to die. He thinks about what a great fight this is going to be and how impressive it will be when he manages to land a hit on something so big. And yet, when confronted with a possessed dreadnought, this fundamental aspect of orc psychology breaks down. The green tide that crashes forward against every other enemy suddenly finds excuses to go around these particular war machines. War bosses who would normally fight anything that moves suddenly develop an urgent need to be somewhere else when a hellbrute shambles onto the battlefield. Even the most basic orc boys, whose thoughts rarely extend beyond finding the next fight, instinctively avoid engaging with these twisted amalgamations of machine and demon. The question that has puzzled observers for millennia is simple. What is it about possessed dreadnoughts that triggers this response in creatures that otherwise fear nothing? The sacred dead, Imperial dreadnoughts. Explained. Before we can understand what makes possessed dreadnoughts so different, we must first understand what dreadnoughts are in their original, uncorrupted form. In the armies of the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, dreadnoughts occupy a unique and revered position. They are walking tombs, armored sarcophagi on legs that contain the shattered remains of Space Marines too badly wounded to continue fighting in their original bodies, but too valuable to allow to die. The creation of a dreadnought is a process steeped in ritual and reverence. When a Space Marine suffers injuries so catastrophic that even the enhanced healing abilities of their modified biology cannot save them, they face a choice. Most will simply die, their gene seed harvested for the next generation of warriors, and their names added to their chapter's rolls of honor. But for a select few, those whose experience, wisdom, and skill are deemed too precious to lose, another option exists. The mortally wounded warrior can be interred within the armored chassis of a dreadnought, their broken body sustained by the machine's life support systems, while their consciousness remains active to continue serving their chapter. This is presented to Space Marines as a great honor, and for many, it genuinely is. The ability to continue fighting for the Emperor, even after one's body has been destroyed, is seen as the ultimate expression of dedication. A dreadnought can serve for centuries or even millennia, waking for battles and then returning to a state of suspended animation between conflicts. They become living legends, walking pieces of their chapter's history, who have fought in campaigns that other Marines know only from the historical records. Their wisdom and experience are sought after by chapter masters and captains, making them valued counselors as well as formidable warriors. From a purely military perspective, dreadnoughts are devastating weapons of war. They combine the tactical intelligence of a Space Marine veteran with the armor and firepower of a main battle tank. Their weapons range from assault cannons that can shred infantry to lascannons capable of penetrating enemy armor. Their close combat weapons include massive power fists that can crush vehicles with a single blow, and heavy flamers for dealing with concentrated infantry. A single dreadnought can turn the tide of a battle, their presence on the battlefield inspiring their brothers while spreading terror among the enemy. Orks, generally speaking, love fighting dreadnoughts. A big metal box that walks around, shoots guns and hits things is exactly the kind of opponent that appeals to the Ork mindset. It is big enough to be an impressive target, but not so overwhelming that it cannot be engaged. It is tough enough to provide a proper challenge, but can eventually be worn down through sustained assault. Fighting a dreadnought gives an Ork the opportunity to test himself against one of the Imperium's most formidable war machines, and potentially to loot parts from it afterward if he manages to bring it down. There is a simplicity and honesty to fighting an Imperial dreadnought that aligns perfectly with how Orks understand combat. Orks have even created their own version of dreadnoughts called Death Dreads. These ramshackle war machines follow the same basic concept as their Imperial counterparts, with an Ork pilot permanently wired into the machine's systems. However, the Ork approach to the concept is characteristically different. Where Space Marines are interred in dreadnoughts because they have been mortally wounded, Orks volunteer to be put into Death Dreads, specifically to become bigger and more dangerous. The process is painful and disorienting, requiring both a mech boy to handle the mechanical aspects and a pain boy to deal with the surgical elements, but many Orks consider it worthwhile for the raw killing power it provides. There is a dark irony to Death Dreads that Orks seem oblivious to. Once installed in the machine, an Ork pilot quickly comes to regret the decision. The experience of being permanently welded inside a claustrophobic metal box, unable to feel the wind or sun, unable to properly enjoy the sensation of combat in the way a normal Ork would, drives them slowly insane by Ork standards. Other Orks call this condition running mad, and it manifests as an even greater aggression and bloodlust than normal Orks display. Between battles, Death Dread pilots are often kept shackled or restrained, as they will kill anything that comes near them in their frustration. Only when released onto the battlefield can they find some measure of relief, taking out their rage on the enemy in an orgy of destruction. Despite this psychological toll, Death Dreads remain popular in Ork armies. They provide the kind of straightforward combat effectiveness that Orks admire. More importantly, they represent a kind of fighting that Orks understand and respect. The pilot inside is still fundamentally an Ork, thinking Orkish thoughts and fighting in an Orkish way. The machine amplifies their natural abilities, but does not fundamentally change what they are. This stands in stark contrast to what happens when chaos gets involved in the process. The relationship between Orks and Imperial dreadnoughts is one of mutual, if grudging, respect through combat. When an Ork faces a dreadnought, there is a purity to the engagement. It is a straightforward test of strength, endurance, and combat ability. The dreadnought pilot, for all that they are encased in a walking tomb, remains fundamentally a warrior following a warrior's code. They fight for their chapter, for the Emperor, and for the continued defense of humanity. There is nothing particularly mysterious or confusing about this from an Ork perspective. Big metal thing wants to fight. Ork wants to fight. Fighting happens. It is clean, simple, and satisfying in the way that Ork combat is meant to be. This baseline understanding of what a dreadnought is and how it functions becomes crucial when we examine what happens when chaos corruption enters the picture. The transformation from honored war machine to possessed horror fundamentally changes not just the physical characteristics of the dreadnought, but its very nature. And it is this transformation, this corruption of something that Orks understand into something they instinctively recognize as wrong, that triggers their unique reaction. Chaos, corruption, when honor becomes horror. The forces of chaos represent one of the greatest threats in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and their ability to corrupt and transform what they touch is legendary. When a Space Marine dreadnought falls to chaos, either because its pilot was corrupted before interment, or because the machine itself was captured and subjected to dark rituals, the transformation that results creates something far removed from the honored warrior it once was. Understanding this transformation requires understanding what chaos corruption actually is and how it affects both biological organisms and mechanical constructs. Chaos is not simply evil in an abstract sense. It is a fundamental force of the universe, born from the collective psychic emanations of sentient beings and given form in the Imperium, the realm of pure psychic energy that exists parallel to real space. The four major chaos gods, Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh, are vast entities formed from the strongest emotions and urges of mortal beings. Khorne embodies rage, violence, and bloodlust. Nurgle represents decay, entropy, and the acceptance of mortality. Tzeentch is the manifestation of change, ambition, and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. Slaanesh personifies excess, hedonism, and the pursuit of pleasure taken to its ultimate extreme. When these entities or their demonic servants touch the material realm, they corrupt and transform what they contact according to their nature. This corruption is not merely physical, though the physical manifestations are often the most visible. It is spiritual, psychological, and metaphysical. A being touched by chaos is fundamentally changed at every level of their existence. Their thoughts are twisted toward the service of their patron god. Their bodies are mutated to better serve their new purpose. Their very souls are bound to the powers they serve, ensuring that even death may not free them for chaos. Space Marines. This corruption is a choice, however twisted that choice might be. The traitor legions that sided with Warmaster Horus during the Horus Heresy made a conscious decision to turn against the Emperor and embrace the powers of chaos. Their journey from loyal defenders of humanity to the monstrous champions of the ruinous powers was gradual, a series of compromises and rationalizations that led them ever deeper into damnation. By the time they realized the true cost of their choices, it was far too late to turn back. But for dreadnoughts, the situation is more complicated and, in many ways, more tragic. A space marine interred in a dreadnought before his legions fall to chaos finds himself in an impossible situation when his brothers turn traitor. Trapped within his metal prison, unable to fight or flee, he is forced to watch as everything he fought for is corrupted and destroyed. Some resist until the end, their sarcophagi eventually destroyed by their former brothers when their continued loyalty becomes an inconvenience. Others, worn down by millennia of isolation and the constant whispers of the warp, eventually succumb to the same corruption that claimed their legion. The descent into madness is slower for them, but no less complete. The physical transformation that accompanies this corruption is dramatic. Where once stood a noble war machine bearing the proud colors and heraldry of a loyal Space Marine chapter, there now shambles a twisted mockery of what it once was. The armor warps and mutates, growing spikes and organic protrusions that seem to move of their own accord. The weapons, once tools of the Emperor's justice, become instruments of pure malice, their barrels twisted into shapes that should not function, but somehow continue to spit death at their targets. The whole machine begins to blur the line between mechanical and organic, metal fusing with demonic flesh in ways that make it impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. This is the state of most Chaos Dreadnoughts, war machines that have been corrupted by millennia of exposure to the warp, but remain fundamentally what they once were, machines piloted by living beings. They are horrible, certainly, and fighting them is a nightmare for anyone unlucky enough to face them in combat. But they are not, strictly speaking, possessed in the sense we are discussing. The transformation of a dreadnought into a hellbrute represents a further step in this corruption, a deeper fusion of machine and malevolence that creates something genuinely new. Hellbrutes are what happens when the line between machine and demon is not just blurred, but erased entirely. The armor of the dreadnought is not simply corrupted, but transformed into something that is simultaneously metal and flesh. The pilot within is no longer a discrete entity operating a machine, but has become fused with the construct itself in a nightmare synthesis. Over centuries or millennia of exposure to chaos, energies, the sarcophagus that houses the pilot's body, begins to merge with the pilot himself. Organic tissue grows into the mechanical components, while metal invades the organic body. The resulting entity is neither fully machine nor fully alive, but something horrifically in between. The psychological state of a hellbrute pilot is beyond what most minds can comprehend. They are trapped in a state of perpetual agony, feeling the pain of every blow the machine body takes magnified through their nervous system. They are aware of their condition, understanding on some level what they have become, but are powerless to escape it. The madness that results from this imprisonment is absolute and all-consuming. Between battles, hellbrutes must be kept chained and locked away, for they will attack anything that comes near them, friend or foe alike. Their rage and hatred are so complete that only the most powerful sorcerers can hope to control them, and even then, that control is tenuous at best. When a hellbrute is unleashed onto the battlefield, it is not fighting with any sense of tactics or strategy. It is simply expressing its rage and pain in the only way it knows how, by destroying everything in its path. The psychological torment that defines its existence manifests as an unstoppable killing frenzy. It will charge forward heedlessly, ignoring wounds that would stop a normal warrior, driven by a need to inflict suffering on others that might somehow lessen its own endless agony. The sounds it makes, transmitted through corrupted voxcasters, are the screams and howls of a mind that has been shattered by its existence, a cacophony of rage and despair that is disturbing to anyone who hears it. But even hellbrutes, horrifying as they are, represent only the middle stage of this corruption. The truly nightmarish creations emerge when chaos takes the process one step further, when a demon is not simply allowed to corrupt a dreadnought, but is actively bound within its chassis, creating a possessed dreadnought in the truest sense of the term. These are machines like the Maharagal-tainted dreadnought used by the word-bearers, constructs that are no longer piloted by anything even remotely human, but have become vessels for demonic entities from the warp itself. The creation of a possessed dreadnought requires specific and horrifying rituals. Dark apostles and chaos sorcerers must summon a demon from the warp and bind it within the armored chassis of the dreadnought through arcane ceremonies that require enormous sacrifices of blood and souls. The demon, forced into this prison of metal and ceramite, rages against its confinement, even as it finds itself able to affect the material realm more directly than would normally be possible. The resulting construct is something that exists in both real space and the warp simultaneously, a living gateway between dimensions that radiates malevolent psychic energy. These possessed dreadnoughts are fundamentally different from anything else on the battlefield. They are not machines operated by pilots, however corrupted those pilots might be. They are not biological organisms, however mutated they might appear. They are pieces of the warp itself given physical form, immaterial horrors wrapped in a shell of metal and forced to walk in the material realm. The air around them literally distorts with warp energy, reality itself bending in their presence as the barrier between real space and the immaterium grows thin. To look upon one is to see something that should not exist, something that violates the fundamental laws of physics and biology simultaneously. The demon bound within a possessed dreadnought experiences its imprisonment as both torment and opportunity. It is confined to the material realm in a way that demons normally are not, unable to retreat fully into the warp when threatened. But this confinement also allows it to persist in real space far longer than would normally be possible, to wage war upon the material universe without the usual limitations that constrain demonic manifestation. The machine body provides a focus and an anchor, allowing the demon to channel its malevolence with a concentration that pure warp entities rarely achieve. For anyone facing a possessed dreadnought in combat, the experience is fundamentally different from fighting even a corrupted hellbrute. The sense of wrongness that emanates from these machines is palpable, a feeling that reality itself is being violated by their presence. Psychically sensitive individuals often report physical nausea and disorientation when near possessed dreadnoughts, as if their very existence creates a kind of static in the fabric of reality. Even normal humans with no psychic ability whatsoever often find themselves filled with an instinctive dread when these machines approach, a primal recognition that they are facing something that fundamentally should not exist. The warp signature. Why possessed dreadnoughts are different. The key to understanding the Ork reaction to possessed dreadnoughts lies in examining what makes these war machines fundamentally different from every other enemy the Orks face, including other chaos forces. The difference is not primarily physical, though the physical manifestations are certainly disturbing. The difference is psychic, operating on a level that even the Orks themselves do not consciously understand, but respond to on pure instinct. Every being and object in the Warhammer 40,000 universe exists in two states simultaneously. There is the physical, material existence in real space, the dimension where most events occur and where the laws of physics generally apply. But there is also a psychic or immaterial existence in the warp, the realm of pure psychic energy where emotion and thought have tangible power. For most objects and non-sentient beings, this warp presence is minimal or non-existent. For living, thinking beings, particularly those with strong emotions or psychic ability, the warp presence is significant and can affect reality in various ways. Orks, as we have discussed, generate a powerful gestalt psychic field called the WH40K. This field is their collective presence in the warp, the combined psychic signature of all Orks in a given area. It is a relatively simple signature, reflecting the uncomplicated nature of Ork psychology. It pulses with excitement during battle, dims when Orks are idle, and grows stronger as more Orks gather together. It is aggressive and violent, certainly, but it is also fundamentally clean in a way that is difficult to explain. The WH40K field is pure Orkiness, uncomplicated by guilt, doubt, or the complex emotions that plague more sophisticated species. Demons and chaos entities have a very different kind of warp presence. They are beings of the warp who have taken on characteristics and personalities based on the emotions and urges of mortal beings. Their warp signature is inherently corruptive, carrying with it the taint of their patron god and the malevolence of their nature. When a demon manifests in real space, it brings a piece of the warp with it, creating a localized distortion in reality that can be felt by anyone with even minimal psychic sensitivity. Possessed dreadnoughts combine these two aspects in a way that creates something unique and uniquely disturbing. The machine itself has a warp presence because it has been touched by chaos energies and because a demon is bound within it. But unlike a demon that manifests in a purely biological body or one that possesses a simpler machine, a possessed dreadnought retains much of its mechanical nature. The result is a warp signature that reads as both machine and demon simultaneously, something that should not be possible according to the normal rules that govern how the warp and real space interact. When an orc encounters a possessed dreadnought, their natural psychic sensitivity, the same sensitivity that allows the wah field to function, picks up on this contradictory warp signature. To an orc's psychic perception, which operates entirely on an instinctive level, a possessed dreadnought reads as something that is wrong in a fundamental way. It is not simply an enemy, which would trigger the orc's natural aggression. It is not simply a demon, which orcs can and do fight when necessary. It is something in between, something that violates the basic categories by which an orc unconsciously understands the universe. This reaction is compounded by how possessed dreadnoughts interact with the WH40K field itself. The gestalt psychic energy that orcs generate is fundamentally at odds with chaos energy. While both are psychic phenomena, they operate according to different principles and serve different purposes. The WH40K field is a collective unconscious force generated by living beings who are, for all their violence and aggression, relatively simple and honest in their nature. Chaos energy is inherently corruptive and transformative, seeking to change and twist whatever it touches according to the will of the chaos gods. When a possessed dreadnought enters an area saturated with WH40K energy, there is a kind of psychic conflict that occurs. The two energies do not mesh or blend, but rather repel each other, like oil and water being forced into the same container. Orcs in the vicinity feel this conflict as a sense of wrongness, of something being fundamentally out of place. It manifests not as fear in the human sense, but as a deep, instinctive revulsion. The possessed dreadnought becomes, in effect, a psychic blank spot in the WH40K field, a dead zone where the normal psychic connections between orcs are disrupted or distorted. This disruption has practical effects on orc behavior and combat effectiveness. The WH40K field normally serves to coordinate orc actions in battle, not through conscious communication, but through unconscious psychic cues. Orcs instinctively know when to charge together, when to consolidate their forces, when one group needs support from another. All of this happens without any need for formal communication or tactical planning, simply through the shared psychic connection that binds all orcs together. But in the presence of a possessed dreadnought, this connection is weakened or severed entirely. Orcs find themselves unable to properly coordinate their attacks, unable to feel the reassuring presence of their fellow boys in the usual way. The effect is similar to what happens when orcs are separated from the main body of a WH40K for too long. Individual orcs or small groups cut off from the larger gestalt field become less aggressive, less confident, and more prone to retreating or fleeing when faced with superior opposition. They lose the psychic reinforcement that normally makes them fearless. In the presence of a possessed dreadnought, even orcs who are surrounded by their fellows experience a localized version of this isolation. The psychic dead zone created by the demon machine disrupts the normal flow of WH40K energy, leaving them feeling alone and vulnerable in a way that orcs are psychologically incapable of processing properly. There is also the matter of how possessed dreadnoughts physically manifest in ways that trigger orc instincts. Orcs are relatively simple beings, but they are not stupid, and their instincts have been honed over millions of years to recognize genuine threats. When they look at a normal dreadnought, even a corrupted hellbrute, they see something they can understand. It is a big metal box with weapons. It can be shot, it can be hit with choppers, it can be brought down through sustained effort. The fundamental category of what it is remains clear. But possessed dreadnoughts do not behave like normal machines. Their movements are wrong, too fluid in some ways, and too jerky in others, as if the laws of physics are negotiable suggestions rather than absolute rules. Their weapons fire with effects that extend beyond simple kinetic or energy damage, leaving psychic scars on anyone struck. The sounds they make, the screams and howls transmitted through their vox casters, contain harmonics that exist partly in real space and partly in the warp, creating a dissonance that even non-psychic beings find disturbing. Smoke and energy that pour from their exhausts and weapon ports swirl in patterns that hurt to look at directly, forming shapes that might be coincidental or might be demonic sigils. All of these physical manifestations combine to create an overall impression that even an orc can recognize as wrong. It is not that the possessed dreadnought is dangerous. Orcs love dangerous enemies. It is not that it is big and tough. Orcs relish the challenge of bringing down formidable foes. It is that it represents a violation of the natural order that even orc instincts rebel against. The demon machine is something that should not exist according to the fundamental rules by which orcs unconsciously understand the universe, and their psychic nature makes them more sensitive to this wrongness than other, more sophisticated species might be. The instinctive avoidance, how orcs react. Understanding the theory behind why orcs avoid possessed dreadnoughts is one thing. Observing how this manifests in actual combat situations provides crucial context for just how unusual this behavior is and how it contradicts everything we know about orc psychology and battlefield doctrine. The phenomenon has been documented across numerous campaigns and conflicts, providing a significant body of evidence for this peculiar exception to orc fearlessness. Imperial Guard regiments that have fought alongside Space Marine chapters against orc incursions have reported the behavior multiple times. Commissars and officers note that when Chaos forces deploy possessed dreadnoughts, orc attacks that were moments before proceeding with typical green tide ferocity will suddenly lose momentum. The orcs do not turn and flee in the manner of a routed human army. That would be too simple and too comprehensible. Instead, they begin to find reasons to attack in other directions. Orc mobs that were charging directly toward Imperial positions will suddenly veer off course if a possessed dreadnought appears in their path, finding new targets that happen to be conveniently not in the vicinity of the demon machine. War bosses and nobs, the leaders of orc warbands, are supposed to be the biggest and toughest orcs around, the ones who should lead by example in seeking out the strongest enemies. But even these massive greenskins show reluctance when faced with possessed dreadnoughts. They do not admit to this reluctance, of course. That would be fundamentally un-orky and would undermine their authority in the eyes of their subordinates. Instead, they rationalize the avoidance in ways that preserve their image while still keeping their distance from the demon machines. A war boss might declare that possessed dreadnoughts are not proper fights because they do not behave like normal enemies. He might claim they are too weird and therefore not worth the effort. He might redirect his forces toward other targets while claiming that those targets are more important or will provide better loot. The rationalization does not really matter. What matters is that a being who would normally charge headlong at any enemy, regardless of the odds, is finding excuses to avoid a specific type of foe. And other orcs are accepting those excuses without the challenges that would normally follow such apparent cowardice. This acceptance is itself significant. Orc society is built on constant testing of hierarchy through combat. Any sign of weakness, any hint that a leader is not as tough as he claims to be, would normally trigger immediate challenges from subordinates looking to take his place. But when an entire orc force collectively avoids possessed dreadnoughts, this normal process breaks down. The boys do not challenge their war boss for avoiding these enemies because they themselves want to avoid them just as much. The shared instinctive revulsion creates a kind of silent agreement that these particular enemies are, for reasons that no orc could or would articulate, acceptable to avoid. Space Marine chapters that have deployed alongside or against orc forces have made similar observations. Librarians, the psychically gifted space marines who can perceive warp energies more directly than normal humans, have noted the disruption in the WH field when possessed dreadnoughts are present. They describe it as watching a single rock create ripples across an entire pond. The WH energy, normally a uniform blanket of aggressive psychic noise, develops gaps and distortions around the demon machines. Orks caught within these psychic dead zones become noticeably less coordinated and less aggressive, their actions losing the fluid, instinctive cooperation that normally characterizes Ork warfare. Chaos forces, for their part, have begun to recognize and occasionally exploit this weakness, though not as effectively or consistently as one might expect. Chaos Lords who have witnessed Ork forces avoiding their possessed dreadnoughts understand that this represents a significant tactical opportunity. In theory, these war machines could be deployed as psychic shepherds, herding Ork forces away from critical objectives or creating corridors through which other Chaos forces could attack without facing the full fury of the WH. In practice, this strategy faces significant limitations. The primary limitation is that possessed dreadnoughts are incredibly difficult to control, even for their supposed masters. The demons bound within these machines rage against their imprisonment constantly. They do not take orders well, cannot be trusted to follow complex strategic plans, and will often attack anything nearby, regardless of whether it is friend or foe. Deploying them in a way that specifically exploits the Ork avoidance response would require a level of coordination and control that most Chaos warbands simply cannot achieve. The possessed dreadnoughts are more likely to be pointed in a general direction and then unleashed to wreak havoc, with only the loosest oversight from their Chaos Space Marine masters. Furthermore, the very nature of Chaos forces works against the kind of coordinated strategy that would most effectively exploit this weakness. Chaos warbands are typically collections of competing interests held together by the personal charisma and power of their leaders. Different factions within a single warband may worship different Chaos gods, pursue different objectives, and have very different ideas about what constitutes an acceptable level of risk in combat. Getting these disparate elements to work together effectively is challenging enough without trying to implement sophisticated tactics based on psychic interactions that most Chaos Space Marines barely understand themselves. There have been notable exceptions, documented cases where Chaos forces have successfully exploited Ork avoidance of possessed dreadnoughts to achieve tactical or strategic objectives. During the Chaos incursion on the Forge world of Metallica, a Wordbearer's warband used their Maharagal dreadnoughts to create gaps in the Ork siege lines surrounding an Imperial stronghold. The Orks, who had been systematically overwhelming Imperial defenses through sheer weight of numbers, found themselves unable to maintain their usual pressure in sectors where the possessed dreadnoughts deployed. This created opportunities for Chaos forces to strike at weakened points in the siege lines, eventually breaking the Ork assault entirely. Similarly, during the Third War for Armageddon, a warband of the Black Legion discovered that they could use their Hellbrutes and possessed dreadnoughts to deny key terrain to Ork forces. By positioning these demon machines in strategic locations, they created zones that Ork forces would instinctively avoid or take circuitous routes to bypass. This allowed the Chaos forces to control territory with far fewer troops than would normally be required, freeing up warriors for offensive operations elsewhere on the battlefield. But these examples remain the exception rather than the rule. Most Chaos forces deploy their possessed dreadnoughts as shock troops and terror weapons rather than as sophisticated tools for controlling enemy movement. The machines are too valuable as heavy assault units to relegate them to what amounts to scarecrow duty, frightening Orks away rather than engaging them directly. And there is always the risk that, given sufficient time or sufficient provocation, even Orks might overcome their instinctive avoidance and attack anyway, especially if the possessed dreadnought is the only thing standing between them and a really good fight elsewhere. It is worth noting that the Ork response to possessed dreadnoughts is not absolute avoidance in all circumstances. When Orks have no choice but to engage with these demon machines, when they are cornered, or when the possessed dreadnought is actively hunting them down, they will fight. But even then, the combat is different from typical Ork engagements. There is none of the usual enthusiasm, none of the gleeful roaring and cheerful violence that characterizes most Ork warfare. Instead, the fighting is grim and mechanical, Orks attacking because they must, rather than because they want to. And as soon as an opportunity presents itself to disengage and find literally any other fight, they will take it. The duration of combat also tends to be shorter when Orks do engage possessed dreadnoughts. In normal circumstances, Orks will continue fighting even when taking heavy casualties, driven by the excitement of battle and the reinforcing effect of the WH field. But when fighting possessed dreadnoughts, Ork forces reach their breaking point much more quickly. The disruption in the WH field means they do not receive the usual psychic reinforcement from their fellow Orks, making each casualty feel more significant and each wound more debilitating. What might normally be a prolonged, grinding battle becomes a brief, intense engagement that ends with the Orks withdrawing or redirecting their forces elsewhere. The broader implications for 40k warfare. The Ork avoidance of possessed dreadnoughts, while interesting in its own right, has broader implications for how we understand warfare in the Warhammer 40,000 universe and the complex interactions between different psychic phenomena. This singular exception to Ork fearlessness illuminates several important aspects of 40k lore that might otherwise remain obscure, offering insights into the nature of the WH field, the mechanics of chaos corruption, and the hidden rules that govern combat in this dark future. First and foremost, the phenomenon confirms that the WH field is not simply collective aggression or shared enthusiasm for battle, but a genuine psychic force with specific properties and limitations. Imperial xenobiologists and Adeptus Mechanicus researchers have debated the exact nature of Ork psychic ability for millennia. Some argue that the Gestalt field is nothing more than a form of telepathic communication that Orks use unconsciously. Others suggest it is a kind of reality warping effect, where Ork belief literally changes the laws of physics to match their expectations. The truth appears to be more complex than either explanation alone can capture. The interaction between the WH field and possessed dreadnoughts demonstrates that Ork psychic ability has structure and coherence beyond simple wish fulfillment. The field reacts to specific warp signatures in predictable ways, showing that it follows rules, even if those rules are not immediately obvious to outside observers. The repulsion that Orks feel toward possessed dreadnoughts is not random or arbitrary, but reflects a fundamental incompatibility between two different types of psychic energy. This suggests that the WH field, for all its seeming simplicity, is a sophisticated phenomenon that has been honed over millions of years to serve specific purposes. The defensive nature of this reaction is particularly noteworthy. The old ones created the Orks, or rather created the Krork, from which modern Orks descended, as weapons to fight in the war in heaven. They needed soldiers who could face the Necrons and their Khatan masters, beings of incredible power who operated according to rules fundamentally different from those governing organic life. The fact that modern Orks instinctively avoid entities that blur the line between material and immaterial existence suggests that this avoidance was built into them from the beginning, a defensive mechanism to prevent them from engaging with enemies they were not designed to fight. This interpretation gains support when we consider what Orks were fighting during the war in heaven and what threats they were designed to counter. The Necrons, while incredibly dangerous, were purely physical beings operating entirely in real space. They had no warp presence, no psychic abilities, and no connection to the immaterial realm. The Krork, with their massive size, advanced technology, and powerful WH field, were perfectly designed to fight this kind of enemy, but beings that existed partly or wholly in the warp. entities that could not be simply shot or chopped, but required different approaches entirely. Those were threats the Krork were not meant to engage directly. The Old Ones themselves were powerful psychic beings who understood the warp far better than any species that has come since. They would have recognized that sending their warrior race against enemies that operated primarily through warp manipulation would be both ineffective and dangerous. Better to build in an instinctive avoidance, a psychic immune response that would keep their soldiers away from threats they were not equipped to handle. The fact that this ancient programming still functions in modern Orks, degraded and simplified though they are compared to the original Krork, speaks to how fundamental this defensive mechanism is to the Orkoid species. From a strategic perspective, this weakness in Ork psychology represents a significant vulnerability that Imperial forces could potentially exploit, though doing so would require access to possessed Dreadnoughts or similar warp-touched constructs. The moral and practical implications of such a strategy are obviously problematic. Deploying demon engines or possessed war machines in defense of the Imperium would be the height of heresy, requiring the user to traffic with the very powers of chaos that the Imperium exists to oppose. No sane Imperial commander would consider such an option, and any who did would quickly find themselves facing the attention of the Inquisition. However, the existence of this vulnerability does explain certain otherwise puzzling historical events. There are recorded instances of Ork wags losing momentum or falling apart for no apparent reason. Cases where a seemingly unstoppable green tide suddenly ground to a halt or redirected itself away from critical Imperial targets. In some of these cases, the cessation of the Ork threat coincided with the emergence of chaos forces in the same region. While Imperial historians typically attribute these developments to divine providence or the Emperor's protection, the more cynical among the Inquisition understand that there may have been more tangible factors at work. A chaos warband emerging in the right place at the right time, with possessed Dreadnoughts or similar demon engines deployed where Ork forces could not avoid detecting them, might have inadvertently saved Imperial worlds without any intention of doing so. The phenomenon also highlights the strange and often contradictory nature of warfare in the 41st millennium. We have a situation where the most fearless warriors in the galaxy, beings who charge laughing at enemies that inspire terror in everyone else, are instinctively repelled by a specific type of war machine. Meanwhile, that war machine, created and deployed by humanity's most implacable enemies, happens to be one of the few things capable of deterring the Ork threat without direct combat. The irony is thick enough that even the Chaos Gods might appreciate it, each in their own way. For the Imperium's understanding of Orks, this exception to their fearlessness offers valuable insights that could improve tactical and strategic planning. Recognizing that Orks do have limits, that their aggression and fearlessness are not absolutely universal, allows for more nuanced approaches to combating them. It suggests that psychological warfare, while ineffective in most traditional forms against Orks, might work if approached from the right angle. Not through intimidation or terror, which Orks simply do not feel, but through exploitation of their psychic sensitivities and the specific ways the Wah field can be disrupted or interfered with. Research into the exact mechanisms by which possessed Dreadnoughts affect the WAG field could potentially lead to the development of new weapons or tactics specifically designed to exploit this vulnerability. Devices that generate similar warp signatures, artificial constructs that mimic the psychic disruption caused by demon engines without actually requiring demonic possession. These are theoretically possible and would provide the Imperium with powerful tools for combating Ork invasions. Of course, such research would require close cooperation between the Adeptus Mechanicus, who understand technology, and entities like the Inquisition or even sanctioned psychers, who understand the warp. The political and theological complications of such collaboration would be substantial, but the potential benefits might justify the risk. From a chaos perspective, The phenomenon represents a curious anomaly in their endless war against all other forces in the galaxy. Chaos thrives on corruption and transformation, spreading its influence through the corruption of individuals, societies, and entire worlds. But in the case of the Orks, this usual strategy finds limited purchase. Orks are remarkably resistant to chaos corruption for reasons that go beyond simple immunity to physical mutation. Their psychic nature, the WH40K field itself, seems to insulate them from the whispers and promises that turn so many other beings to the service of the ruinous powers. The fact that possessed dreadnoughts actively repel Orks rather than drawing them in represents a failure of one of Chaos's primary strategies. Usually, chaos corruption has an allure, a dark seduction that draws beings toward it even as it destroys them. The power it offers, the promises it makes, the simple visceral appeal of giving in to base urges and abandoning restraint, all of these serve to make chaos attractive on some level, even to those who recognize its dangers. But for Orks, this mechanism does not work. Possessed dreadnoughts do not tempt or seduce or offer anything that Orks would want. They simply exist as wrongness made manifest, and Orks want nothing to do with them. This suggests fundamental limits to chaos power that may not be immediately apparent. While chaos can corrupt and destroy almost anything given enough time and opportunity, there are forms of existence that remain largely beyond its reach. Orks represent one such form, beings whose psychic nature is fundamentally incompatible with warp-based corruption in the traditional sense. The irony that this immunity was built into them by the same old ones who inadvertently contributed to the birth of chaos by creating so many psychic species is almost certainly lost on everyone involved, but it remains a crucial aspect of the balance of power in the 40k universe. Conclusion. The limits of fearlessness. In the grim darkness of the far future, where war is eternal and compassion is considered weakness, the Orks stand out as perhaps the purest expression of violence the universe has ever known. They fight because fighting is what they do, because combat is the air they breathe and the purpose for which they were created. They fear nothing, respect only strength, and consider death in battle to be no tragedy at all. They are, in many ways, the perfect soldiers, completely dedicated to warfare, without the messy complications of fear, doubt, or self-preservation that plague more sophisticated species. And yet, as we have explored, even these ultimate warriors have their limits. The possessed dreadnought represents something so fundamentally wrong that even Ork instincts recognize it as a violation of the natural order. The demon machine existing simultaneously in real space, and the warp, bound neither wholly to physical laws nor completely to immaterial ones, creates a psychic distortion that the WH40K field cannot tolerate. The result is the only documented case of Orks consistently avoiding a specific type of enemy, not through conscious decision, but through pure instinct. This exception illuminates several important truths about the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It confirms that the WH40K field is more than simple aggression or collective enthusiasm, but a sophisticated psychic phenomenon with specific properties and limitations. It demonstrates that even beings designed from the cellular level to be fearless warriors have built-in defensive mechanisms to protect them from threats they were not designed to fight. It shows that chaos corruption, for all its power and pervasiveness, has limits and can be resisted by certain forms of existence that operate according to different rules. Perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that in a universe as complex and strange as that of Warhammer 40,000, there are always exceptions to every rule. The Orks fear nothing, except for the one thing that triggers their deepest psychic instincts. Chaos corrupts everything it touches, except for the beings whose psychic nature makes them fundamentally incompatible with warp-based corruption. The WH40K field can make almost anything work through collective belief, but it cannot overcome the fundamental wrongness of a demon bound in metal. Understanding these exceptions helps us better understand the rules they violate. The Ork avoidance of possessed dreadnoughts is not a random quirk or an inconsistency in the law. It is a window into the deeper mechanics of how psychic phenomena work in the 40k universe, how the warp and real space interact, and how ancient weapons designed millions of years ago still carry echoes of their original programming. The old ones created the Krork to fight specific enemies in specific ways, and modern Orks, degraded and simplified though they are, still follow the basic parameters of that ancient design. For those who fight against Orks, whether Imperial forces defending humanity's worlds or Chaos warbands pursuing their own dark agendas, this knowledge offers potential tactical advantages. The Orks can be maneuvered, their aggression redirected, their WAG disrupted through careful exploitation of this vulnerability. But such exploitation comes with costs and complications that make it a tool to be used carefully, if at all. The Imperium cannot and will not deploy demon engines in its defense. Chaos forces struggle to control their possessed dreadnoughts well enough to use them strategically. The knowledge exists, but putting it into practice remains challenging. For the Orks themselves, this weakness matters not at all because they do not recognize it as weakness. An Ork warboss who redirects his Wah away from a possessed dreadnought does not see himself as being cowardly or cautious. He is simply going to fight something more proper, something more Orky, something that will give him a better scrap. The rationalization comes naturally because the instinct is so deep that questioning it would require a level of self-awareness that Orks simply do not possess. They avoid possessed dreadnoughts. They do not think about why they avoid them. And they certainly do not question whether avoiding them might make them less than perfectly fearless. In the end, the story of why Orks will not fight possessed dreadnoughts is a microcosm of the Warhammer 40,000 universe itself. It is a universe where ancient engineering still affects modern behavior, where psychic forces shape reality in ways that even the most advanced science struggles to explain, and where the most straightforward warriors in the galaxy are influenced by mechanisms they cannot understand and would not care about even if they could. It is a universe where exceptions prove rules, where contradictions define truth, and where the most fearless beings ever created turn away from enemies they were never designed to fight. The possessed dreadnought shambles across the battlefield, a horror of twisted metal and bound demons, radiating wrongness into both real space and the warp. Imperial soldiers freeze in terror at its approach. Chaos cultists cheer its arrival, and the Orks, the fearless green tide that crashes against every other enemy without hesitation, find urgent business elsewhere. They do not run, because Orks do not run from fights. They simply discover that the best fights are happening somewhere else, anywhere else, as far from the demon machine as they can get, while still claiming to be looking for a proper scrap. This is the exception that proves the rule. The Orks fear nothing, and yet they avoid the one thing that their ancient programming identified as not worth fighting. In a universe where there is only war, even the most dedicated warriors have their limits, even if they themselves would never admit to them. The possessed dreadnought stands as a monument to these limits, a walking reminder that even in the 41st millennium, some things remain too wrong for even Orks to cheerfully engage. Like and subscribe. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the stranger quirks of Warhammer 40k lore, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We explore the dark corners of the 41st millennium every week, bringing you the stories, characters, and strange phenomena that make this universe so compelling. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on Ork psychology, possessed dreadnoughts, or any other 40k topics you would like us to cover. And remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, even the most fearless warriors have something that makes them uncomfortable. For Orks, it is demon machines that exist in defiance of reality itself. What is it for you? Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video. For the Emperor, for the WAG, or for whoever else you fight for in this galaxy of endless war.